The air in Bakersfield, California was unusually crisp for an autumn morning. The sun hadn't yet risen over the dry hills, and a soft golden haze lingered like it wasn't quite ready to surrender the night. David Miller, 61 years old, stood on his front porch in his slippers and flannel robe, cradling a chipped mug of black coffee. His house was quiet, too quiet some days, and though he would never admit it out loud, the silence after Margaret passed had never stopped echoing. He rubbed his right shoulder absently, feeling that small bump again. It had been there for a few weeks now, maybe longer, but it didn't hurt. Just a hard little knot under the skin, like a pebble lodged in a sock. Probably nothing, he told himself. A cyst, maybe, or a pimple. Old man things. His back was a roadmap of moles and spots already. What was one more? David took another sip of coffee and turned to look at the dried rose bushes lining the yard. Margaret had loved those roses. He tried to keep them alive after she died, but they didn't take kindly to his clumsy hands. He wasn't built for delicate things. Inside, the old floorboards creaked under his steps. He sat down at the kitchen table, reached for the crossword puzzle, then paused. His shoulder again. He pulled back the sleeve of his robe and pressed 2 fingers against the bump. Firmer now, still painless, but different. He felt something tighten in his chest, an unease. He tried to shake it off, turning his focus back to the crossword. He penciled in a few letters, then stared blankly at the next clue. 6 letters, surgical removal. The answer floated to the surface of his mind before he even realized. Excision. He chuckled bitterly. Maybe the paper was trying to tell him something. But he didn't go to doctors. Not anymore. Not unless it was serious. After Margaret's diagnosis, he'd spent more time in waiting rooms and fluorescent-lit hallways than most people did in a lifetime. He knew how it went. One little test led to another, then a referral, then a specialist, and before you knew it, you were hundreds of dollars in, with more questions than answers. He still remembered the look on Margaret's face when she opened the envelope with the hospital bill, the bill that came 2 weeks after her final chemo session. She had shaken her head and muttered, "I'm not even worth this much." They had paid what they could, borrowed the rest. Margaret never complained, but he knew the debt weighed on her. It weighed on him, too. So no, he wasn't going down that road again, especially not for a harmless bump on the shoulder. Later that day, David stopped by the hardware store to pick up a few things for the porch light. Steve, the young clerk with the shaggy hair and endless energy, greeted him like always. "Hey, Mr. Miller, what's up?" David grunted in reply, holding out the burnt bulb from the light fixture. As Steve led him to the right aisle, the younger man glanced at David's shoulder. "Whoa, you get bit by something?" he asked, half joking. David looked down. The bump was now visible through the thin cotton of his shirt, a round, swollen dome just beneath the fabric. "Huh," David muttered. "Guess it's growing." "You should probably get that checked out," Steve said, trying to sound casual. "Looks kinda angry." David waved him off. "Bah, it's fine. Probably just a fatty lump. Had one years ago on my leg. Went away on its own. Still, man, you never know. My uncle had something like that and it turned into—" "I said it's fine," David snapped, sharper than he meant to. Steve raised his hands in surrender. Back home, David stood in front of the bathroom mirror, turning awkwardly to see over his shoulder. The bump looked redder now, maybe even a little inflamed. He pressed gently around it. Still no pain. Just pressure. He grabbed a damp cloth and pressed it to the area, the way Margaret used to tell him to do when he had boils as a kid. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, the dull ache in his shoulder slowly morphing into something sharper, more insistent. He dreamed of Margaret, not the healthy, vibrant version of her, but the pale, thinning woman from the hospital bed. In the dream, she was staring at him, silently, her hand over her chest. When he woke, he was sweating. The pain had spread. Still, David resisted. He was stubborn like that. He hated hospitals, hated being fussed over, hated the way doctors looked at you, like you were a puzzle they'd solve with the right billing code. 2 more days passed. The swelling increased. The skin over the bump began to stretch taut and shiny. It was warm to the touch. His shirt started sticking to it, and every movement sent a jolt of discomfort down his arm. Still, he refused to go in. On the 4th morning, the pain woke him at 4 a.m. A deep, throbbing fire just under the skin. He staggered into the bathroom, pulled off his shirt, and nearly dropped to his knees. The lump had turned purple. A small head had formed at the center, white and glistening. He didn't need a doctor to tell him what that meant. The thing was going to burst. He sat on the toilet lid, breathing heavily, gripping the edge of the sink with both hands. He thought about his father, who had died in his sleep, about Margaret, who hadn't, about all the little warnings our bodies give us that we ignore. Finally he stood, grabbed his wallet, and went to the car. He didn't pack a bag, didn't leave a note, just got in, started the engine, and drove himself to the ER. The parking lot was half empty when he pulled in. A nurse looked up as he walked through the sliding doors. She took one look at his shoulder and called for a wheelchair. "I can walk," he muttered. She gave him a look. "You can also pass out. Let's not be dramatic." He lowered himself into the chair without protest. As they wheeled him back, he caught his reflection in the metal panel of a supply cabinet, gray, gaunt, and tired. But beneath the fatigue, there was something else, something that looked a lot like fear. The emergency room wasn't particularly busy, but David still waited nearly 2 hours before someone came to examine him. The triage nurse had scribbled notes, taken his temperature, and made a few non-committal sounds when she saw his shoulder. Then she asked for his insurance card. He handed over his Medicare card and muttered, "That's all I've got." She nodded, typed something into the computer, and frowned. "Do you have supplemental coverage?" "Nope, just that." She clicked her tongue, not unkindly, but with the quiet efficiency of someone used to bad news. "Okay, well, depending on what procedures are needed, some of this may not be covered. Just letting you know." David didn't respond. He didn't ask how much. He already knew the answer, more than he wanted to hear, more than he could afford. He was finally brought into a small room with a paper-covered bed, a cracked linoleum floor, and the smell of antiseptic clinging to the walls. A young doctor, probably no older than 30, walked in and glanced briefly at David's chart. "You've got a pretty angry abscess there," the doctor said, pulling on gloves. "How long's it been like that?" "Couple of weeks, maybe 3. The doctor arched an eyebrow. 3 weeks, and it just now started hurting?" David nodded. "Didn't want to come in unless I had to." "Well, you had to," the doctor said flatly. "This is infected. We'll need to drain it, maybe pack it. Possibly run some cultures if the infection's deeper." "You diabetic?" "No," David said, then hesitated. "But my wife was." "All right," the doctor said, already examining the swollen mass. "We'll numb the area, make a small incision, drain the pus, and then monitor for a day or 2. You'll likely need antibiotics. If the infection doesn't improve or spreads, we may need to consider IV antibiotics or surgical removal of the entire cyst wall." "Sound good?" David didn't like any of it, but he nodded. "Sure." The doctor smiled politely. "We'll have a nurse come prep you. You'll feel better soon." As he left, David leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him, steady and soulless. He didn't fear the knife or the infection. What twisted in his gut was something far more familiar, the dread of the bill. He'd seen it before. After Margaret's treatments, their mailbox had become a dumping ground for coded threats, statements with numbers he couldn't pronounce, and payment plans that stretched further than their retirement ever did. Even with insurance, it had bled them dry. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table late at night, calculator in one hand, Margaret's prescriptions in the other, trying to decide whether they could afford both. In the end, they'd always chosen the medicine, and little by little they'd sold what they could: tools, the old guitar, even Margaret's jewelry. Now, sitting alone in a chilly ER room, David felt the same tightening in his chest. He didn't want to go back to those days. He wasn't sure he could survive them a second time. A nurse came in. She introduced herself, Mia, and explained the procedure again, as if the doctor hadn't just done the same. David didn't mind. Her voice was softer, less clinical. She reminded him of a niece he hadn't spoken to in years. As she prepared the tools, she glanced at him and said, "You're lucky it didn't get worse." David scoffed. "Luck's expensive these days." She smiled faintly but didn't argue. She probably heard comments like that all the time. Maybe she agreed, maybe she was just too tired to say it. The procedure was quick but unpleasant. The local anesthetic worked well enough, but David could still feel the pressure and tugging as the blade broke skin. Then the warmth of infection spilling out, the sharp odor, the gauze, the packing. Mia worked quickly, efficiently, and with surprising gentleness. When it was over, she taped a bandage over his shoulder and instructed him to keep it dry. "The doctor will come back later and talk to you about antibiotics and follow-up. You might need to stay overnight if there's risk of spreading." David sighed. "That mean I'm going to need to pay for a hospital bed?" Mia hesitated, then replied, "Depends on your coverage. But if it helps, this hospital has a financial assistance program. He chuckled bitterly. If that program paid my bills, it'd help. She smiled again, but there was sadness behind it, a kind of knowing. She didn't argue because she couldn't. They both knew the truth. After she left, David lay on the stiff bed and stared at the ceiling. The numbness in his shoulder began to wear off, replaced by a dull ache. It wasn't unbearable, but it throbbed with every heartbeat, a steady, nagging reminder of what had just happened. He turned his thoughts to something else, anything else. But instead, his mind returned to Margaret. The day she'd told him she felt a lump, the way she'd downplayed it, laughing it off. Probably just a clogged duct, she'd said. He'd believed her. Or maybe, deep down, he'd wanted to believe her because the alternative was too heavy. By the time she saw a doctor, it was stage 3. 6 months of chemo. 3 surgeries. The final months she barely spoke. He'd sat beside her hospital bed every day, watching the woman he loved become a shadow. The only thing more painful than watching her fade was knowing that, maybe if they'd acted sooner. He blinked hard. Not now, not here. An hour passed. Then 2. A different nurse came in, took his vitals, checked the dressing, and made a note on a clipboard. David asked, "Any idea when I can go?" "We're keeping you overnight for observation," she said. "Doctor will reassess in the morning. We also need to wait for your blood work." He nodded. "Do I have to sign something?" "We'll bring the paperwork in the morning." He didn't ask what the cost would be. He knew it didn't matter. Late that night, alone in the quiet hospital room, David reached for his phone. It was old and scratched, the screen slightly cracked. He opened the calculator app and began adding numbers in his head. ER visit, procedure, overnight stay, lab tests, antibiotics, follow-up. By the time he finished, the total made his stomach twist. He closed the app and let the phone drop to his chest. Outside, a nurse's shoes squeaked faintly on the linoleum floor. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped steadily. David closed his eyes. The pain in his shoulder pulsed like a second heartbeat, but it was nothing compared to the weight he carried in his chest. He whispered into the dark, "How the hell did it get this bad?" The next morning arrived slowly, dragging with it a pale gray sky and a stiffness in David's shoulder that had settled in like a tenant refusing to leave. The pain wasn't sharp, but it throbbed with every breath, a dull, insistent reminder of the previous night. He sat upright in the hospital bed, blinking away the crust of sleep from his eyes, and stared blankly at the beige walls. The curtain in his semi-private room remained half-drawn, offering little privacy but just enough to pretend he was alone. Across the room, an empty bed sat neatly made, untouched. At 6:47 a.m., a nurse entered the room, clipboard in hand, her shoes squeaking on the floor. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said in a voice far too cheerful for the hour. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I got stabbed by a pocket knife and billed for a chainsaw," David muttered. She chuckled politely, but didn't slow down. She checked his vitals, lifted the bandage on his shoulder, made notes, and told him a doctor would be in shortly. He nodded, letting her do her job. She was just another cog in the machine. The real game hadn't started yet. That would come later, when billing walked through the door. An hour passed, then another. David watched the second hand tick along the wall clock, his stomach growling faintly. He hadn't eaten since noon the day before. Finally, around 9:30, a man in scrubs entered, carrying a small stack of papers and a tablet. He introduced himself as Jeremy from Patient Financial Services. David's mouth went dry. "Here we go," he said under his breath. Jeremy smiled tightly, the way someone does when they're about to say something unpleasant. "Mr. Miller, I just wanted to go over your coverage and discuss next steps regarding your hospital stay." David crossed his arms, wincing slightly. "Fire away." Jeremy pulled up David's file on the tablet. "You're enrolled in Medicare Part A and B, correct?" "Yup. That's all I've got. No supplemental insurance?" "Nope." Jeremy nodded, as if he'd heard this 1,000 times before. "Okay, so just to clarify, Medicare Part A covers inpatient hospitalization, which includes your overnight stay. However, since this visit began in the emergency room and involved an outpatient procedure initially, Part B applies to some of those services. There is a deductible, which you haven't met this year, and also a 20% coinsurance on many services." David frowned. "So what does that mean?" Jeremy tapped through a few screens. "Well, based on your initial ER visit, the abscess drainage, lab work, imaging, medications, and now your overnight stay, your estimated responsibility is around $2,900, depending on final billing codes. David stared at him, expressionless. Jeremy continued, "We do have payment plan options, and there's also a charity care application, though that depends on income. Would you like to go through those options?" David gave a low, humorless chuckle. "Let me get this straight. I come in here with an infection that could have killed me if I'd waited too long, and now I get to choose between bankruptcy and bureaucracy?" Jeremy hesitated, clearly trained for moments like this. "I understand this is frustrating, sir." "No," David snapped, his voice low but firm. "Frustrating is waiting 3 hours to be seen while your shoulder is leaking pus. This," he waved toward the tablet, "this is extortion in a lab coat." Jeremy didn't argue. He just nodded again, said he'd leave the paperwork, and backed out of the room with the quiet efficiency of someone escaping a room that might explode. David stared at the papers for a long time after that. He didn't touch them, didn't need to. He already knew how this would play out. A few weeks from now the letters would start coming, first politely worded statements, then firmer ones, then calls from third-party collectors who didn't care that he was a widower living on Social Security and a sliver of pension from a sawmill job that didn't even exist anymore. He got dressed slowly, biting back pain as he lifted his arm. A nurse returned to remove his IV line and give him discharge instructions. "You'll need to keep the area clean, avoid lifting anything heavy, and follow up with your primary care physician within a week," she explained. "I don't have a primary," he said. She blinked. "Oh, well, we can refer you to someone." He nodded, but knew he wouldn't call. He couldn't afford another round of visits, labs, prescriptions, all to hear what he already knew: rest, clean, heal. That was free advice. The rest came with too many zeros. At the front desk, he waited while the discharge coordinator clicked through endless windows on her screen. She printed out a packet, clipped it together, and handed it to him with a half smile. "You're all set. Follow-up instructions are in here, as well as billing contacts and financial assistance info." David accepted the packet without comment. As he turned to leave, a younger man sitting in the waiting room caught his eye. The guy was maybe in his late 30s, pale, sweating, clutching his stomach. David paused. The man looked miserable. "You been seen yet?" he asked. The man shook his head. "Been here since 6 a.m. They said it's a 4-hour wait." David nodded slowly. "And the pain?" "Feels like someone's shoving a knife in my gut." David glanced toward the desk. The receptionist was laughing at something on her computer screen. He turned back to the man. "You got insurance?" The man gave a weak smile. "Not really. Got some online plan with a $7,000 deductible." David let out a long breath. "Then you're in for a world of hurt." They sat in silence for a few moments. Then David said, almost to himself, "No one should have to decide between a hospital and their rent." The younger man gave a faint laugh. "Yeah, ain't that the truth?" David left the building with the weight of the packet in one hand and the weight of the system on his shoulders. Outside, the morning had shifted into full sun. He squinted against the brightness, fishing his keys from his pocket. His car groaned as he started it, like even the machine knew how tired he felt. On the drive home, the roads blurred. Not from speed, but from thought. The same looping frustration he couldn't escape. How had things gotten this way? Why did survival come with a price tag? He remembered a news segment he saw weeks ago. Some politician claiming the American healthcare system was the best in the world. Maybe it was, if you were rich, or lucky, or both. For the rest of them, for people like David and Margaret and that guy in the waiting room, it was a gamble. A spin of the wheel, where illness meant debt, and delay meant danger. Back home, the house greeted him with silence. He dropped the packet on the kitchen table and sat down heavily, exhaling like he'd just run a marathon. He pulled the discharge papers from the envelope and stared at the list. Wound care instructions, antibiotics to pick up, a referral to a dermatologist, billing hotline, optional financial counseling. Optional. He laughed. Bitter, dry. Optional was a hell of a word when your choice was paying rent or buying meds. He opened the fridge. Nearly empty. Just a few eggs, a jar of mustard, and a half carton of milk. No matter. He wasn't hungry anyway. Instead, he shuffled to the worn recliner by the window and sank into it. The shoulder ached, but not more than usual. He closed his eyes and muttered, "Margaret, you wouldn't believe this place now." The room didn't answer. It never did. David returned to the clinic 3 days later. The bandage on his shoulder yellowed slightly at the edges, the soreness now a familiar companion. The infection had stabilized, but the doctor wasn't satisfied. The initial drainage had cleared the abscess, but underneath, the remnants of the cyst still lingered. a thick capsule of keratinized tissue, stubborn and silent. It was, as the physician explained, a ticking time bomb. This isn't just about infection, the doctor said, clicking through images on the screen. This cyst likely predates the abscess. If we don't remove the sac entirely, there's a good chance it'll return. And next time, you may not be so lucky. David sat stiffly on the edge of the examination table, jaw clenched. So what now? A minor surgical excision. Local anesthesia, outpatient, will cut out the cyst wall completely. It's the only way to prevent recurrence. David nodded slowly, his fingers tapping anxiously on his knee. The word surgical never sounded minor to him, not since Margaret. The doctor handed him a consent form. We'll schedule it for tomorrow morning. That night sleep evaded him again. He lay awake in his recliner, the soft creak of the old ceiling fan overhead keeping rhythm with the thoughts circling his mind. Margaret had gone through so many procedures, tests, biopsies, scans. At first they'd both clung to hope. Maybe it wasn't cancer, maybe it was just scar tissue. But the truth had arrived swiftly and without mercy. He hadn't forgotten the look in her eyes when she signed her own surgical consent forms, brave on the outside, terrified underneath. He understood now. Even a minor procedure becomes a mountain when you're climbing it alone. The next morning he arrived early. The outpatient wing was quiet, subdued, and smelled faintly of bleach and hand sanitizer. After check-in, he was ushered to a small pre-op area divided by thin curtains. A nurse handed him a gown and instructions. Strip from the waist up. Leave your valuables with us. Relax. David sat on the gurney, paper gown rustling as he adjusted. He stared at the tile floor, trying not to think. He didn't notice the new nurse enter until she spoke. David Miller? He looked up. The woman standing in front of him had kind, steady eyes and a warm, tired smile. She looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. Her badge read, Emma Carter, RN. That's me, he said. I'll be with you throughout the procedure. Just need to verify some things. She glanced at her clipboard, then at him. You're here for cyst removal on the right shoulder? Yeah. Or whatever's left of it. Emma chuckled lightly, her tone easy but not dismissive. Well, let's see if we can't get rid of it once and for all. As she prepped the IV line and went through her checklist, David found himself watching her movements, calm, efficient, but there was something else, something human that often went missing in hospitals. You been doing this long? He asked. Emma smiled. Almost 25 years. Started back in Memphis, then moved west. David nodded. You don't look old enough for that. She smirked. Flattery before surgery. I'll take it. There was a pause, then David said, You ever get used to this stuff? Emma tilted her head. You mean cutting people open? No. I mean watching people try to act like they're not scared. Her expression softened. Honestly, no. But I've learned to see through it. Fear wears a lot of masks, sarcasm, silence, anger. I've seen 'em all. David looked away. Guess I'm not that original then. You'd be surprised, she said. Then she sat down beside the gurney, lowering her voice slightly. You remind me of my father. He was a steel worker, never trusted doctors, said they were just salesmen with stethoscopes. David cracked a smile. Smart man, stubborn man, she replied. Waited too long to see about a cough. Turned out to be late-stage lung cancer. He didn't even make it through the first round of treatment. The words hit harder than she intended. David's smile faded. Emma noticed. I'm sorry, that wasn't meant to scare you. No, David said quietly. It's just familiar. She waited, sensing something more. My wife, he continued after a moment. She was the same, found a lump, waited, thought it'd go away. By the time we got answers, it was already a battle we couldn't win. Emma reached over, placed a hand gently on his wrist. I'm sorry, she was the brave one, he said. Not me. I just sat next to her and pretended I was strong. Emma's voice softened. You were there. That's more than most. A silence settled between them. Not awkward, but respectful, a shared understanding. Then Emma stood, checked the clock. They'll be ready for you in 10. I'll be right by your side the whole time. You're not alone today. David nodded, eyes misting. Thank you. And for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he felt just a little bit less afraid. The procedure room was cold, brightly lit, and smelled of antiseptic and sterilized steel. David lay on his side atop a narrow surgical table, his right arm resting awkwardly in front of him, shoulder fully exposed. The blue drapes framed the area like a stage, everything else covered or pushed aside, The doctor entered briskly, flanked by a young resident, both in sterile gowns and gloves. "All right, Mr. Miller," the doctor said. "This should take about 20 to 30 minutes. We'll inject a local anesthetic, make a small elliptical incision, and carefully remove the cyst capsule. You shouldn't feel anything more than pressure." David gave a slow nod, his face pale but steady. Emma stood just behind him, one hand gently resting on the gurney rail. She didn't speak, but her presence was grounding, like an anchor in the middle of a storm he hadn't realized he was weathering. The first injection stung sharply, like a bee digging its way under his skin. He flinched slightly, jaw tightening. "Doing okay?" Emma asked softly. "Yeah," he murmured. "Just a reminder I'm still alive." A few minutes later, the area went numb. The doctor tested the site with a small probe, then made the first incision. David couldn't feel the blade, but he heard the subtle sound of skin splitting, a quiet, wet slice that made his breath catch. "You had quite the sac here," the doctor said matter-of-factly as he worked. "Thick-walled, probably a sebaceous cyst originally. When it ruptured, the contents created a perfect breeding ground for infection." The resident asked questions as they worked, and the doctor answered with clinical precision. David, half listening, caught fragments of it. Keratinized debris, inflammation, surrounding tissue appears reactive, but not necrotic. Words that sounded foreign and official, like a language of war between body and bacteria. He turned his head slightly toward Emma. "Ever wonder how many people walk around with these things inside them and don't know?" Emma nodded. "More than you'd think. Cysts are usually harmless unless they rupture or get infected. A lot of folks never even know they have one." "I knew," David said. "I just ignored it." "We all ignore things," Emma replied. "Until we can't." He fell quiet after that, listening to the careful rhythm of surgery, the muted clinks of instruments, the occasional murmur between doctor and assistant, and the ever-present hum of fluorescent lighting above. At one point, the doctor paused. "There's some scarring here. This cyst has been growing for years." David closed his eyes. Of course it had. Things didn't just appear overnight. They started small, manageable, easy to overlook, like a crack in a foundation, a drifting between two people, a cough that lingers, a swelling on your wife's breast. When the doctor finally declared the area clean, the wound was irrigated, then stitched neatly, 5 small sutures in a straight, quiet line. A fresh bandage was applied, and the instruments clattered gently into a metal tray. "You did great," Emma said as she helped reposition him onto his back. David blinked slowly, exhausted but oddly relieved. "That's it?" "That's it," the doctor confirmed. "We'll send the tissue for histology, but I'm not concerned. Standard follow-up in 10 days to remove the stitches." Emma offered him a reassuring smile. "You'll have a scar, but nothing too dramatic." "I've got worse," David said. "Most of them just don't show on the outside." Emma didn't respond right away. Then, with a quiet nod, she said, "Sometimes the ones that don't show are the ones that never heal." Later, back in recovery, David sipped from a paper cup of water while Emma went over post-op care. No heavy lifting, no swimming. Keep the area clean. Watch for signs of infection, redness, swelling, fever. Come back immediately if anything feels wrong. "Got it," David said. "No dancing, no skydiving." Emma smiled. "You joke, but people do the strangest things right after surgery." He looked at her, his voice quieter now. "Thanks for not treating me like a file number." "You're welcome," she replied. "You're more than that." As she stood to leave, David called out, "Hey, Emma." She turned. "You should have been my wife, nurse," he said. "She would have liked you." Emma's smile faltered for a moment, touched by something deeper. "I would have liked her too." When she was gone, David leaned back against the pillow, the room softening in the afternoon light. His shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, a small, pulsing reminder of pain past and healing ahead. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days, allowed himself to rest. David didn't sleep that night. Though the surgery had gone smoothly and the pain was manageable, sleep felt like a stranger pacing just out of reach. He lay in the recovery bed, his shoulder bandaged and pulsing with post-op soreness, but that wasn't what kept him awake. It was the silence. Hospitals at night were strange places, not truly quiet, but filled with the low hum of machines, the occasional beep from monitors, the soft shuffling of nurses' shoes on polished floors. It was a silence that demanded introspection, that sat in the corners of rooms like old ghosts. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, his eyes tracing the same faint cracks over and over. Sometime around midnight, the curtain to his room rustled softly, and Emma stepped in. She was off shift, her scrubs replaced by a cardigan and jeans, hair loosely tied back. In her hand was a paper cup of tea. "You're still awake," she said gently, not surprised. David glanced at the clock. "Guess I'm not the only one." She held up the cup. "Night tea. My grandmother used to swear by it." He gave a tired smile. "Was she a nurse too?" "No," Emma said, settling into the chair beside his bed. "She was a cleaner at a hospital in Memphis. Raised 3 kids by herself. Strongest woman I've ever known." David nodded, thoughtful. "You look like someone raised by strong women." "I look like someone who never learned how to rest," she replied, smiling faintly. They sat in silence for a few moments, the hospital's nocturnal rhythm pulsing quietly around them. David broke the silence. "You ever feel like a hospital is the loneliest place in the world?" Emma looked at him. "All the time." He shifted, grimacing slightly as the motion tugged at his stitches. "It's funny. You're surrounded by people, by noise, by movement. But when you're the one in the bed, it's like being on an island." Emma nodded. "Because you're the only one who knows how it feels from the inside." David's eyes lingered on the ceiling. "I used to think I was invincible, worked 30 years in a sawmill, cut my hand open twice, broke a rib once, got a nail through my foot. Never took more than a day off." "That's what men of your generation were taught to do," Emma said. "Push through." He looked at her, eyes weary. "And now, I get taken out by a bump on my shoulder." "It wasn't just a bump," she said gently. "It was a warning." David let that sit for a moment. "I saw Margaret once," he said quietly. "Right after she died. Not her body, I mean in a dream. She was standing in the kitchen, holding a coffee cup. Just looking at me." Emma waited. She didn't speak, just looked. Like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Or maybe I was the one who couldn't hear it. "Do you think about her often?" "Every day," David said. "She was the calm in the storm. Always saw the good in people. Even when they didn't deserve it." "Did you?" Emma asked, her voice soft. David didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he said finally. "I tried. I wasn't perfect. I got angry. I shut down, especially near the end. Watching someone you love fade like that, it does things to a person, things you don't admit out loud." Emma nodded, her gaze steady. "Caregivers carry more than anyone sees." He looked at her. "You know about that?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "My mom had early onset dementia. I was in nursing school when it started. I tried to keep it together. Work, class, taking care of her. Some days she didn't remember my name. Other days, she thought I was a nurse from her childhood. I bathed her, fed her, watched her forget everything that made her who she was." David swallowed hard. "She died 2 years ago," Emma continued. "In a state-run facility, the kind you don't visit unless you have to. I still dream about her sometimes. Sometimes she remembers me, sometimes she doesn't." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Maybe we're all just carrying these invisible wounds," he said. Emma nodded. "I think we are. The world tells us to be strong, but strength isn't silence." David looked at her, his voice low. "I think I was afraid to know. About this cyst, this infection. I felt it weeks ago. Could have gone in earlier. But something in me just froze." Emma didn't judge him. Fear is powerful, especially when it's built on memory. He nodded slowly. "I thought, if I ignore it, maybe it'll go away. Or at least, maybe I won't have to make decisions. Decisions mean consequences. Consequences mean bills." She leaned forward. "Can I tell you something I've learned over the years? Please. Most people don't avoid doctors because they're lazy or stupid. They avoid them because the system has taught them that knowledge equals cost. That asking questions means opening a door you may not be able to afford to walk through." David stared at her. "Exactly. It's wrong," she said. "But it's real. And it's especially cruel for people who've worked their whole lives, who did everything right and still end up afraid of an X-ray." David shook his head. "I remember when Margaret needed a scan, one of those full-body ones. The insurance denied it twice, said it was not medically necessary. She cried for hours, not because of the denial, but because she felt like a burden." Emma's voice caught. "No one should ever feel that." "No," David said. "But they do. We do." For a while, they didn't speak. The hospital moved on around them. Machines beeped. Footsteps echoed down distant corridors. Life continued in fluorescent stillness. Emma finally stood. I should let you rest. David looked up at her. Thank you. For what? For talking to me like a person. She smiled. You are a person, a good one. As she stepped toward the curtain, David called out one last time. Emma. She turned. If you ever write a book about all this, the lives, the pain, the quiet truths, make sure people know we weren't weak. We were just tired of fighting systems that didn't fight for us. Emma's eyes shimmered in the dim light. I will. She slipped out, and the curtain fell still. David lay back, the sterile scent of the hospital fading as sleep finally crept toward him. In the quiet, he imagined Margaret in the kitchen again, holding her cup, this time smiling, not in warning, but in peace. The call came 3 days later. David was sitting at the kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of coffee forgotten at his elbow, a folded newspaper in front of him that he hadn't really read. The sky outside was a dull gray, the kind that made time feel heavier, slower. When the phone rang, he let it ring twice before answering. This is David. Hi, Mr. Miller, this is Dr. Singh's office. I'm calling with the results from your pathology report. His heart stuttered. Just a beat. He gripped the phone tighter. Go ahead. There was a pause just long enough to be cruel. Then the voice said, good news. The tissue sample came back benign. No signs of malignancy. It was a ruptured sebaceous cyst, consistent with chronic inflammation but no cancer. David exhaled slowly, a tension he didn't know he'd been holding finally loosening in his chest. That's good, he said. It is, the woman said, her tone genuinely kind. We still recommend you keep the follow-up appointment next week so the doctor can check the healing, but overall, this is a great outcome. He thanked her, hung up, and sat there for a long time. No cancer, no chemo, no death sentence. He should have felt relief, joy even. And yet, all he could do was stare at the window and feel something else. Not sadness, not exactly. More like exhaustion, the kind that crept into your bones and made celebration feel like another chore, because now came the rest of it. That same afternoon, the envelope arrived. It was thick. Marked this, "Ice not a bill" in all caps, but he knew better. These weren't warnings, they were preludes. The real bills would follow, like sharks circling the scent of blood. He sat down again and peeled it open, line after line of codes and itemized charges, printed in clinical font with all the warmth of a tax form. ER visit, $712. Ultrasound, $289. Incision and drainage, $1,340. Pathology, $472. Surgical excision, $2,100. Facility fee, sterile supplies, post-op monitoring. Subtotal, $6,957. Medicare payment, $4,280. Patient responsibility, $2,677. He stared at the number for a long time. Then he set the paper down, stood up, walked to the sink, and turned on the tap. The water ran cold. He splashed some onto his face, breathing slowly, trying to settle the sting behind his eyes. It wasn't just about the money, not really. It was about what it represented, a punishment for doing the right thing too late, a toll gate on the road to staying alive. He thought of all the people he knew, the old guys from the Union Hall, the neighbors down the street, the waitress at the diner who worked 2 jobs and still didn't have insurance. What would they do if this happened to them? No, he corrected himself. When this happened to them. He went back to the table, pulled a pen from the drawer, and circled the patient responsibility total. Then he wrote beside it, in small capital letters, lucky. That's what the doctor would say if he asked. You were lucky, David. It could have been cancer. And he was. But he couldn't shake the bitterness that came with that word. Because lucky didn't erase the 2,600. Lucky didn't mean he could sleep soundly knowing a single fall, a single prescription, a single ambulance ride could wipe out what little he had. There was no victory here, only survival with strings attached. Later that night, he called Emma. He hadn't planned to. He wasn't sure if it was appropriate. But her number had been on the discharge papers under nursing liaison, and in that moment, he needed someone who would understand, not just medically, but humanly. She answered on the 3rd ring. David? Hey, he said, voice hoarse. Sorry to bother you. You're not, she said immediately. Everything okay? Got the results? It's benign. That's wonderful. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess. She was silent for a moment, then said, "It doesn't feel like good news, does it?" David laughed once, bitter. "You always know what I'm thinking." "No," she replied, "but I know what it's like to get good news that still comes with a bill attached." He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "They sent the statement today, $2,600, and that's after insurance." Emma sighed. "I'm so sorry, David. I'm not telling you to complain," he said. "Just needed to say it out loud, you know?" "I do," she said. "I really do." There was another pause. He realized he liked her pauses. They weren't uncomfortable. They were honest. Then she said, "You're not alone, David. I know it feels like it. Like the system wants you to feel isolated, like your struggle is your fault. But it's not." His throat tightened. He didn't trust his voice, so he just said, "Thank you." She didn't ask for more. She just stayed on the line, breathing with him, in solidarity. For the first time that day, he felt a little less like a statistic. The next morning, David sat at the dining table, laptop open in front of him. The screen glowed softly in the early light, the blinking cursor waiting patiently in a blank document. He hadn't written in a long time, not since Margaret passed. Back then, he'd tried to keep a small blog going, mostly stories about her, about growing old, about grief. But over time, the words had dried up. Now they were returning, tentative but persistent, like weeds pushing through concrete. He began to type. 3 weeks ago, I found a bump on my shoulder. I ignored it. Like many of us do. Because we're busy, because we're scared, because we know what comes next. Tests, appointments, bills, and maybe, deep down, we believe that if we don't name it, it won't become real. His fingers moved slowly, but the words felt honest, unpolished, necessary. That bump turned out to be an abscess, a minor surgery, a follow-up, and a bill for $2,677. That's what survival costs these days. And the worst part isn't even the number, it's the silence. The part of us that thinks we should be grateful, that we should smile and say, "Well, at least it wasn't cancer," while quietly checking our bank accounts and wondering what we'll cut next month to cover it. He paused, rereading what he had written. The shame was still there, just beneath the surface, not for the diagnosis, but for how long he'd waited, for how much fear dictated his choices, but writing it down gave him something he hadn't felt in days. Control. We live in a country where going to the doctor feels like rolling the dice, where so many of us don't ask questions, not because we don't care, but because we can't afford the answers. We don't delay care because we're irresponsible. We delay it because we've been taught to associate pain with debt. And when we do finally go, we're told we're lucky. Lucky that it wasn't worse. Lucky that the bill wasn't higher. Lucky that we didn't die. He leaned back in the chair, the keys cooling beneath his fingertips. This wasn't just about him anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about every person who sat in a waiting room calculating rent against copays. Every parent who split a prescription pill in half to make it last. Every retiree who looked at a swollen ankle and thought, maybe it'll get better by Monday. David added one more line. This isn't healthcare. This is survival with a payment plan. He hit publish. By evening, the post had started circulating. His old readers shared it. A local community group reposted it. Comments began trickling in. People thanking him, telling their own stories. A woman in Ohio wrote about how her husband died waiting for insurance approval. A man in Texas said he hadn't seen a doctor in 8 years. A retired nurse from Pennsylvania simply wrote, "Thank you for saying what so many of us are thinking." David read each comment carefully. Some made him angry, some made him cry, but all of them made him feel less alone. And that, more than any bandage, any pill, was healing. Later that week, Emma called again. Her voice carried warmth as always. "I read your post," she said. "It's spreading. People are listening." "I didn't expect that," David said. "I just needed to get it out." "Sometimes," she said, "the most important truths are the ones we speak not because we want to change the world, but because the world has changed us." David was quiet for a moment. "Do you think it matters?" Emma answered without hesitation. "Yes. Because someone, somewhere, is going to read that post and go to the doctor. Maybe a week earlier than they would have. Maybe that's enough." He nodded slowly. That would have made a difference for Margaret. There was a pause. Then she asked gently, "How's your shoulder?" "Healing," he said, "still sore, but better. And the rest of you?" David gave a small laugh. "That part's taking longer." Emma didn't rush the moment. "You've been through more than a surgery." "Yeah," he said. "Feels like someone cut open more than my skin. Like All the stuff I've buried for years, fear, anger, guilt, it just came spilling out with the pus. That's how healing works, she said. It's messy. And sometimes, you don't know how deep the infection goes until you start cleaning it out. David looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the yard in gold. The rose bushes Margaret once tended were blooming again. He hadn't noticed until just now. I think I want to write more, he said. You should, Emma replied. You have something to say. For the first time in a long time, David believed that might be true. Spring crept slowly into Bakersfield, one bloom at a time. The mornings no longer held the sharp chill of winter, and the rose bushes in David's yard began to show signs of stubborn life, green buds peeking through dry stems, defying the months of neglect. Margaret would have been pleased. She'd always said roses were the most honest flowers, delicate but strong, pretty but thorned. Survivors. David's shoulder healed steadily, the stitches removed with minimal fuss. The scar was small but visible, a thin pink line just below his collarbone, like a punctuation mark left by a sentence life needed to finish. He stared at it often in the mirror, not with shame but curiosity, like he was still learning how to live with it. His writing, however, bloomed much faster than his roses. What started as a single blog post turned into a habit, a ritual. Every morning, with coffee in hand, he'd sit at his kitchen table and type. Sometimes it was reflections on the healthcare system, sometimes stories about Margaret, sometimes just observations from his porch, a neighbor's dog, the slow change in season, the sound of wind moving through brittle trees, and people were reading, his inbox filled with messages from strangers, retired veterans, single mothers, former nurses, cancer survivors, all sharing their own wounds and fears. Some wrote in detail, others in single sentences that said everything, thank you, or you made me feel seen. David replied to each one, carefully and slowly, not with advice but with solidarity. He didn't want to fix anyone, he just wanted them to know they weren't broken. He called his blog The Quiet Part out loud. It felt right. One afternoon he received an email from the community health center. Someone had read his blog and shared it with their outreach coordinator, who then reached out with an invitation. Would you consider speaking at our next senior health seminar? We think your voice could make a real impact. David stared at the message for a long time. The idea of standing in front of a room full of people, telling his story, was terrifying. But something inside him, the same part that had kept him alive through the pain and fear and the long lonely nights, whispered, "You're not just healing for yourself anymore." He said yes. The event took place in a modest room at the community center. Folding chairs, a donated microphone, a stack of brochures about Medicare and diabetes and wound care. About 30 people attended, most of them in their 60s or older. Some came with walkers, others with notebooks, a few with their adult children. David stood at the front, notes in his hand, breath shallow. Then he looked up, saw Emma standing near the back, her arms folded, her eyes steady. He began, "I'm not a doctor. I'm not a health expert. I'm not here to tell you what to eat or how many steps to walk every day." He let the silence settle before continuing. "I'm here because 3 months ago, I almost died of something that started as a bump on my shoulder. I ignored it, because I was afraid, not of pain, not of dying, but of what it would cost to find out what was wrong." A few heads nodded, one woman dabbed at her eye. David told them everything, not just the symptoms or the diagnosis, but the long wait in the ER, the moment of fear before surgery, the bill that arrived like a slap. He spoke about Margaret, about the guilt and the grief, and the long shadow of regret, about how easy it was to let the system push you into silence, and about how speaking up, finally, had helped him begin to heal. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then someone clapped, then another, until the room filled with applause, not thunderous but sincere, the kind that came from people who knew exactly what he was talking about. Afterward, several attendees approached him, some just shook his hand. Others shared their stories. One man, a retired mechanic, said he'd had a lump on his thigh for 6 months, but hadn't told anyone. Another woman said her husband had died after delaying care for a tooth infection that turned septic. "You helped me understand," she said, "that we're not lazy, we're scared, and that fear is justified." David left the event feeling more grounded than he had in years. Not euphoric, not healed, but anchored, as if sharing his story had finally stitched up something deeper than the wound on his shoulder. That night, he added a new post to the blog, Scars are strange things. They're proof that you've been wounded, but also proof that you've healed. And healing doesn't mean returning to who you were before. It means becoming someone new, someone who knows what pain is and chooses to keep going anyway. I have a scar on my shoulder now, but the real one was inside me. And slowly, stitch by stitch, word by word, it's closing. He clicked publish and closed the laptop. Then he stepped outside into the night air, breathing deep. The porch light buzzed overhead. The roses, even in the dark, seemed to glow with life. He reached down, plucked a fading bloom, and held it gently in his hand. Not everything had to be perfect to be beautiful. Some things just had to survive. 3 weeks after his community center speech, David received a letter in the mail, the old-fashioned kind, stamped and sealed. It was from a statewide organization called Voices for Patient Equity, inviting him to speak at their annual Health Justice Forum in Sacramento. They had read his blog, watched a recording of his previous talk, and believed his story needed to be heard on a larger stage. David wasn't sure what larger meant until he saw the program. The forum was scheduled at a convention hall near the Capitol. Hundreds of attendees, policymakers, health administrators, doctors, nurses, advocates, and patients. Panels, breakout sessions, keynote speakers. The list of names intimidated him. PhDs, MDs, state officials. And there, in the program's final session, closing words, a patient's story. David Miller. He nearly said no. But Emma called that same day. You've come this far, she told him. Finish the walk. So he did. He arrived early, dressed in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit around the shoulders. The room was massive. Rows of chairs fanned out before a high stage with 2 large projection screens on either side. He stood backstage as organizers checked microphones and adjusted lighting. His palms were damp, his throat dry. But when his name was announced and he stepped into the lights, something changed. The room hushed, and he began to speak. I'm David Miller, he said simply. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a healthcare expert. I'm just a man who got sick and learned what it really costs to survive. He paused, looking out across the crowd. Some were already leaning in. I want to tell you a story, not because it's dramatic, but because it's ordinary, because it could happen to any of us. And then he told it, from the beginning, the bump on his shoulder, the delay, the infection, the hospital, the bills, the fear. He didn't dress it up, he didn't try to be eloquent, he simply spoke the truth. I waited to seek care because I was afraid, he said, afraid of what it might be, but more afraid of what it might cost. He described the long hours in the waiting room, the feeling of invisibility, the bill that arrived like punishment for doing the right thing too late. He spoke about Margaret, her misdiagnosis, the guilt he still carried, and he talked about Emma, about how her presence reminded him that compassion still existed in the system, even if the system forgot how to show it. Then he shifted. I've been told I was lucky, he said. Lucky the cyst wasn't cancer. Lucky Medicare paid part of it. Lucky I lived. He looked up, his voice steady but edged. But let me ask you, when did survival become a matter of luck? The room fell silent. He continued. I worked my whole life, paid taxes, followed the rules, and yet when I needed care, I hesitated. Not because I didn't value my life, but because I knew I might not afford to save it. A few heads nodded. Some in the front row looked away. Now I share my story not for pity, but for purpose, because I know I'm not alone. Because every day, across this country, people are making impossible choices. Do I fill the prescription or pay the rent? Do I go to the ER or wait until I can't walk? He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. This system is sick, not because of its doctors or its nurses. They are doing miracles with broken tools, but because we've allowed care to become commerce, and we've told people like me that our lives have price tags. A slow murmur rippled through the audience. I'm not here to propose legislation, he said. I'm not qualified for that. But I am qualified to tell you what it feels like to be scared of your own body, because the cure might bankrupt you. He paused again, then added, softer this time, we can't fix what we refuse to name, and what we have, what we've built, is not healthcare, it's risk management. And for people like me, the risk has already taken too much. By the time he finished, the room was still, a quiet, heavy kind of stillness. Then slowly, a woman stood. Then another, and another. Applause erupted, not polite, not obligatory, real. When David stepped down from the stage, a man in a blazer, Someone from the state health department approached him. "Mr. Miller," he said, shaking his hand, "you just said what 100 white papers couldn't." David smiled, weary but proud. Maybe because I lived it. As he walked toward the exit, people stopped him, not for photos but to thank him. A nurse told him she was quitting her job because she couldn't keep watching patients suffer due to red tape. A public health student said she was changing her thesis because of his words. A legislator asked if he would be willing to speak again, maybe at the State House next time. David didn't promise anything. He just nodded, shook hands, and kept walking. By the time he got outside, the sun was beginning to set. He loosened his collar, breathed in the cooling air, and felt something shift inside him. Not closure, not victory, but momentum. And that was enough to take the next step. The drive home from Sacramento felt different this time. There were no hospital bandages, no thick envelopes on the passenger seat, no tightness in his chest. Just the road, the open sky, and the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but earned. David rolled the window halfway down, letting the wind tousle what was left of his graying hair. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel brave, but he felt real, and after everything, that mattered. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically. A small thing, a motion sensor doing its job, but it felt symbolic. He was being seen, not just by a machine, by people, by a system he had once thought would forget him. Inside, the house still held its quiet, familiar hum, the old refrigerator, the creak of floorboards, the gentle sigh of aging walls. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table, the same table where he'd opened his first hospital bill, the same one where he'd written that first blog post. Now, the laptop was open again. His inbox overflowed. There were hundreds of new messages, some from strangers, some from people who had heard him speak, a few from staffers, doctors, and even one from a journalist wanting to write a feature. But the one that caught his eye came from a name he didn't recognize. Luis Moreno, 17, Fresno Key. He clicked. "Hi, Mr. Miller, I watched your speech with my grandma. She's 74 and doesn't speak much English. She cried while watching you. She said she thought no one in this country knew how scared she was to go to the doctor. I want you to know I translated your whole talk for her afterward, and she said it made her feel like she existed. Like someone finally said what she couldn't." David read the message 3 times. It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. He hit reply and typed, slowly, "Tell your grandmother she's not alone. None of us are. And thank you for carrying her voice. You're doing something powerful." When he hit send, he sat back in his chair, watching the blinking cursor disappear. The next morning he posted on his blog again. "People keep asking me what changed, why I started speaking up, and the truth is, I didn't mean to. I didn't plan this. I got sick. I got scared. I paid too much, and I got tired of pretending that was okay. I didn't set out to fight the system. I just told the truth, and the truth, it turns out, is contagious." He paused, then added, "If you're reading this, and you're carrying a story like mine, tell it. You don't need a stage. You don't need permission. Just start talking. Start writing. Start showing the world that your pain isn't a statistic. It's a warning. And maybe, if enough of us speak, they'll have to listen." That post became his most shared yet. Days later, a small independent news outlet ran a profile on him titled, "The Man Who Said What Everyone Was Afraid to." Other blogs picked it up. A few podcasts reached out. Even a state senator's office sent an inquiry. But David didn't chase any of it. He still spent most mornings on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood slowly stir to life. He still watered Margaret's roses, still fed the stray cat that wandered by each evening like it owned the place. He had become, in many ways, exactly who he had always been, just a little louder, a little less afraid, a little more connected. Emma called often, sometimes just to say hi, sometimes to read him a message from someone new who had reached out through the hospital's advocacy office after hearing his story. They had started printing his blog posts and leaving them in waiting rooms. "They're not medical," she'd said, "but they're medicine." One day she read him a note from a patient named Ruth. "I saw your writing on the table while waiting for my labs. I was about to leave because I couldn't afford the copay. Then I read your words. You don't delay because you don't care. You delay because the system taught you to be afraid. I stayed. I'm getting treatment now. Thank you for giving me the words I didn't know I needed. David didn't cry when she read it, but he stared out the window for a long time after, watching the wind move through the trees like something invisible but powerful. That night, he ended another blog post with a question. What would happen if we built a system where people weren't punished for asking for help? Where no one had to choose between knowing the truth and keeping the lights on? What would it mean to live in a country where health wasn't a gamble, but a promise? He didn't claim to have the answers, but he knew the first step was asking better questions. And so, with every story he told, every word he typed, and every scar he showed, he became more than a patient. He became a witness. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one sees, the fears we carry in silence, the choices we're forced to make when survival comes with a price tag. But every scar tells a story, and when we share those stories, we don't just heal ourselves, we remind others that they're not alone. So next time you see someone hesitate before walking into a clinic, or ignore a pain they've carried for weeks, ask yourself, are they careless, or are they just scared of what the truth might cost them? Because maybe the real diagnosis we need is compassion. If this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a neighbor, maybe even yourself, what part of it spoke to you the most? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story too, and if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment that could matter.